Hi, my name is Frank Bongiorno. I'm professor of saxophone and jazz studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. A few years ago, I was asked to produce a reed maintenance DVD for saxophonists. The following is only an excerpt from the DVD, but it covers some basic ideas for you to maintain your saxophone reeds, not only for everyday practice, but also for performance. Keep in mind, there are many ways you can maintain your reeds, so the following presents only a few ways that have worked for me and my students, and I hope they work for you as well. As saxophonists, we are dependent at times upon the condition of the reed for the success of our performances. This small piece of wood can sometimes be the cause of poor tone, lack of response, bad intonation, and other problems affecting saxophone playing. There are many techniques and sometimes rituals used by saxophonists to help remedy some of these problems, but usually with varying success. The following DVD will discuss some basic approaches I use when working with the reed in order to hopefully remedy some common reed problems and achieve a better consistency in reed performance. Let's first begin with the selection of the reed. For beginners, some teachers suggest using a very soft reed, number 2 or even less, so that the student can successfully perform the initial notes. Although this will provide a sense of achievement in some students, I find that in the long run, a soft reed could cause some embouchure problems later. For example, a young student will sometimes make improper adjustments with the embouchure to compensate for poor tone and intonation, especially in the upper register. Also, if the young student's embouchure is slightly firmer than usual, the reed will close up and not speak as it should. Instead, I usually recommend a medium strength reed, number 2.5, number 3 at first, so that the embouchure can develop appropriately. As for the developing or professional saxophonist, choosing a reed brand and or strength is often done in conjunction with the mouthpiece one is using, specifically the type and size of the mouthpiece. For example, classical mouthpieces have shorter facings and or smaller tip openings than jazz mouthpieces. The facing of the mouthpiece is the distance from the tip to where the reed meets the mouthpiece along the side of the mouthpiece. The tip opening is the distance between the front top of the mouthpiece and the front tip of the reed. Given these factors, the saxophonist should select a reed strength and brand that will allow the reed to vibrate freely with some resistance and not close the tip opening in order to play with a full, projecting tone quality. In the end, all saxophonists, reed brands, and mouthpieces are not created equal. Therefore, be flexible with the reed strength selection as long as the results are positive and you can produce a controlled tone with dynamic flexibility while using an appropriate amount of air. Try out a couple reeds in various strengths in order to determine the strength best suited for your playing. Once you have determined the reed strength, purchase several reeds at the strength for your use. If at all possible, I recommend purchasing a box of reeds at a time, rather than 1 or 2 at a time, so that you will have a healthy supply to choose from, or fall back on if one does not respond immediately, or if one chips or cracks. The next step is to prepare your new reeds so their performance will be as consistent as possible during the duration of the life of those reeds. Upon opening a new box of reeds, wet each reed fully and play each one for about 5 minutes per reed during one practice session. Although some saxophonists immerse their reeds in a container of water, I find that if one licks the reed entirely, that is both tip and heel ends, the reed will be sufficiently moistened, like this. Both ends of the new reed are moistened so that the moisture is spread evenly throughout the reed. If the reed is not moistened evenly throughout, you will risk the chance of uneven moisture within the reed and subsequently creating an uneven vibration throughout the reed. Moistening a new reed properly will allow it to vibrate smoothly and evenly throughout, as well as begin the process of closing the pores on a new reed surface so that the reed can develop its consistency and prevent water pockets from appearing, dulling the sound. You can help facilitate the process of closing the reed's pores by rubbing a fingernail on the vamp towards the tip. Be careful not to get too close to the tip of the reed when rubbing it, because the reed tip is sensitive and could splinter or break. Once you moisten the reed thoroughly, play the reed for 5 minutes to get a feel for it. While most new reeds will play for you at first, not all new reeds will be responsive, but don't overreact. Keep in mind that it takes a little time, perhaps up to a week, for the reed to stabilize and to perform consistently, so any significant adjustments to new reeds should be held off until the reed has broken in. As for older reeds, immersing an older reed in water will sometimes revive an unresponsive reed. However, be careful not to immerse a reed too long in water, as it could cause it to become waterlogged and therefore be less vibrant. A small drinking glass or container like this, half filled with water, should be sufficient to soak your reeds. As you play through your reeds, make mental notes on which reeds seem to play best at this stage. Once you have played through each new reed, store them in an environment that will be as constant as possible while allowing them to dry evenly and slowly, as well as allowing for some retention of moisture before its next use. Remember, reeds are simply small pieces of wood. Changes in temperature, humidity, rate of drying, and the amount of moisture in the reed could drastically affect its stability and response. A stable environment can be produced by simply returning the reed back to its box after use and keeping it moist on a daily basis by playing on it for a few minutes, or by placing it in a container that will maintain a constant environment. There are numerous commercially sold containers or devices on the market that maintain an environment conducive for reed consistency. Some of these devices are reed guards, various reed cases, even a simple Ziploc plastic bag. I use a Tupperware container to store my boxes of reeds. However, should you decide to store your reeds in sealed containers, be sure to open these containers daily for a period of time in order to avoid waterlogged reeds and to prevent mold from growing on the reeds. Continue playing on each reed for a few minutes each day. After a week, you should be able to identify the more reliable reeds and begin to use them a bit longer than a few minutes each day. Before long, you should have a handful of reliable reeds to use on a rotating basis. I find that by following this process, the durability of each reed is increased and my supply of playable reeds remain constant. When your reliable reeds begin to wear down, begin the process over again with a new box of reeds. The thought of playing a reed right out of the box worries me a bit because of the many variables that can be imposed on those reeds until they stabilize. Following a simple routine of daily practice on each new reed should allow a bit more consistency with reeds and will allow for more manageable reeds as well. Here are a few helpful suggestions when choosing, storing, and conditioning reeds. Find the appropriate reed strength for you and your mouthpiece first. Purchase a box of reeds at a time rather than one or two reeds. Moisten each reed at the tip and heel end. Play each reed initially for 5 minutes. Continue to play each reed a little more each day, but not too much. Store reeds in an airtight, closed environment, like a Tupperware container. After 1 week of this reed preparation process, identify reeds for practice, performance, or those that are unusable. Unfortunately, preparing new reeds properly does not necessarily ensure they will play trouble-free. Therefore, let's identify some common problems with reeds and suggest some quick and sometimes temporary adjustments for their remedy. First of all, there's not a lot one can do to an irregular reed if the reed cane is not grown, cut, or cured properly. These reeds will often be less resilient and not as responsive than reeds that have matured appropriately. More often than not, reeds that are light brown or somewhat golden colored in the reed's vamp usually are reeds that have been cured or seasoned well. Any green color or tint in the reed is usually a reed that is not yet seasoned. Even though these reeds are still playable, I recommend not using them for a month or longer in order for the reed to have more time to cure properly. In addition to the light brown or golden color, good reeds are evenly cut and tapered on both sides and have a somewhat thicker center or heart in the reed's vamp, shaped like an inverted U. Also, the grain in the reed should be consistent and even from the stock of the reed to the reed's tip. Before we begin our discussion on adjusting reeds, let's take a look at some items we will be using to adjust reeds. Fine sandpaper, 100 or 150 grade. An emery board. A reed knife. A piece of plexiglass. And a reed clipper. A few of the more common reed problems that I have come across as a performer and teacher include warped reeds, unbalanced reeds, and reeds that are either too soft or too hard. A warped reed often has little or no flexibility and at times may not even respond. One way to test for warped reeds is by assembling your reed and mouthpiece as usual, and with the palm of one hand securely covering the chamber hole of the mouthpiece, suck out the air from the chamber through the tip opening. If the reed is sealing, the suction should briefly seal the tip opening and a popping sound from the tip opening's release should occur. A warped reed may also be detected by laying it flat on its table on a small piece of smooth plexiglass after it has been moistened. The reed is warped if air pockets are seen in the moisture between the table of the reed and the plexiglass. There are many reasons why a reed can become warped. However, the underlying factor for this problem is usually an unstable environment or the inconsistency of moisture in the reed on a day-to-day basis. Remember, the reed can be affected by its rate of moisture loss or gain, its immediate environment's temperature and humidity, as well as its compatibility with the mouthpiece that it sits on. Maintaining a stable environment is the best way to combat problems with warping. A stable reed environment can be produced by storing your reeds in one of the many devices discussed earlier in this masterclass. If the problem persists, there are 3 quick solutions I recommend. First of all, try immersing the warped reed in a glass of water for 5 to 10 minutes. Sometimes a reed has dried so much since its last use that it needs to be revitalized by excessive moisture. Be careful not to immerse it too long or it will become waterlogged and will not vibrate as it should. Another possible solution is to place the table of the reed on a piece of paper or fine sandpaper and lightly move the reed back and forth in the direction of the grain in order to smooth the surface and correct the warpage. Finally, a last-ditch emergency effort to at least use the reed is to place a small piece of masking tape on the bottom of the mouthpiece table. The tape should cover about a 1/4 inch of the table of the mouthpiece and may overlap onto the mouthpiece. Once the tape is situated in position, assemble the reed and ligature as usual. The tape will function as a leverage and force the reed into sealing along the rails. An unbalanced reed is a reed that has been cut unevenly so that the sides of the reed are not of the same strength. There's a simple test you can do to check this. With the saxophone assembled, test the strengths of each side of the reed by blowing into each side of the mouthpiece rather than directly in the center as usual. If one side seems to respond with more resistance, then I recommend sanding or cutting a bit off the reed on that side between the rail and the heart of the reed. A reed knife, a piece of fine sandpaper, or an emery board will be sufficient to do the job accordingly. Remember to remove only a small amount of the reed at a time along the side in question, and avoiding the heart as well as the tip of the reed. Then test it. Reeds that play too soft or too hard can be adjusted several ways. The quick and temporary way to cure these problems is to move the reed and ligature on the mouthpiece slightly in the opposite direction depending upon the problem. For example, if the reed is soft, move it up slightly, a millimeter or so, from its normal position on the mouthpiece and move the ligature down on the mouthpiece from its normal position. This will allow for more of the reed to be exposed for vibration, therefore creating a bit more resistance. If the reed is too hard, simply reverse the movement of the reed and ligature to produce less resistance. A longer lasting solution to reed strength problems is to adjust the reeds through sanding or trimming. If the reed is too stiff, try sanding the reed on both sides from the rail to the heart. As before, either a piece of sandpaper, an emery board, or a reed knife will often do the trick for this adjustment. For soft reeds, trimming a very small amount of the tip with a commercial reed trimmer is recommended. Be sure to center the reed on the reed trimmer to maintain an even tip arch, and only trim a small amount of the reed tip off at a time until you have reached the appropriate reed strength. The suggestions discussed in this DVD will help with some of the more basic and common problems with reeds, but there are certainly other methods and practices used by saxophonists that are worth looking into in order to address other reed problems as well as to fine-tune reeds for one's personal preference. I hope this DVD masterclass was helpful in working towards this goal.